Hello, welcome to Paint by Blunders. Today we are looking at the Cryptguard from the new Flesh Eater Courts box that came out just before Christmas. And these little models are fantastic and have been a real joy to paint. A little bit smaller than I thought, but that's a good thing because they look like angry little ghouls, and I really like that. But in this video, I've decided to do them in almost 3 different styles, but I put them in one video essentially because the process is so similar for each one that I feel that it just warrants one video. Let's get to it. So here we are, ghoul number 1, and these are just primed in Grey Seer Spray, but I'm using the Colourforge variant. And the first thing we're going to do is paint all the flesh in Fenrisian Grey. I'm going to use an airbrush for this. This is the only time, except on the model where I've got the pink undershading, that I use an airbrush. So for the flesh, we're going to use Nighthaunt Gloom, and we're going to thin it down with some medium, about 70-30, so we're going to nice and thin. In favour of the thinner, give that a shake around and just slap it all over the skin. As always, the reason why I like doing this a bit thinner is if you're doing a squad of these, you can put 2 coats on some, you can even put 3 coats on some, just to add that tonal variety across the unit. So the example here is the one on the left, I've given 2 coats, the one on the right, I've given a 1 coat. And apologies, this is the pink undershaded one, which is just screamer pink through an airbrush, literally one direction, just underneath him. But the video I had for that is gone a little bit walkies. So we're going to start on the metallics. We are using Vallejo Game Colour Dark Gunmetal. If you're using GW paints, you could easily use Lead Belcher, or if you're doing the whole squad, you could mix it up and use a variety of metal tones just to add a little bit of variety amongst your squad. But I'm just going for something a little bit darker and a little bit grimier. Once I'm happy with all the metallics, I'm going to start moving on to the loincloths and the little bits of rags that they've got. I'm going for Tuskgore flesh, but it depends how you want them to look. You can use these fleshy tones to make it look like they're draped in sort of skin and such, or you could just do brown tones and make it look like leather, or your creamy tones if you wanted to look like cloths and linens. And I'm going to be putting on 2 thin coats of this one, just a little bit of water from the wet palette just to help it flow. So that is all 3 at this stage, and we're going to use Cygor brown on all of them, and it is just going to be to do that like back fur. But again, you could also use Wildwood, you could use Black Legion, just any of those darker brown and black tones, for just squad variety. I'm not a huge fan of, if I've got a unit of 20 of these, every one of them being the absolute carbon copy of the last. And I think contrast paints are a really quick and easy way just to add a tiny amount of variety in very little time. So onto the weapon wraps and the bones that are on the weapons and also piercing the ghoul's skin. I'm using both Rakarth flesh and Shabti bone, but I'm not using them in a way that it will be the exact same on each model. So some I will do the weapon wraps in Rakarth, some I'll do in the cream, and just again for a bit of colour variety because they're all going to go through the same process. So as you can see, with all 3 variations, they go through the same process to start with. And next up, we're going to be using Black Legion and Wildwood just to pick out the wood on the weapons. Also, if they've got any straps, whether it be for armour or belts. And also, there's like drawstrings. And if you wanted to, you could do the strings that are crossing over the bone to attach them to the weapon. And I'm just using them in either order. There's no all of it has to be in black for this, all of it has to be in Wildwood for that. Again, I'm just trying to create very small bits of colour variation. So at this stage, they've all gone through the same process, and I'm going to start doing them individually now. The only thing I've done slightly off camera is if they've got any fleshy bits on them from like bits of people that they've chopped up. All I've done is done the flesh in Cadian flesh tone, and in their mouths, just to save me a bit of time later, I've just used a magenta for the tongues and just done their teeth in the same way that I've done the bones and the wraps. So first up is our clean ghoul, and we're going to use Agrax Earthshade for essentially absolutely everything apart from his skin. And it's as simple as that, because we've got units of these to get on the battlefield. I'm also not too worried about it pooling on the weapon, because it just makes it look a little bit more grimy, and it's something we can work with. So I'll put a timestamp in the description to carry on with this clean ghoul, because we're going to start moving on to the oil-based grimy ghouls. So, onto our first undershaded ghoul, and guess what we're going to do? That's right, the streaking grime is back. And as always, we're going straight out the pot with an old brush, and we are smothering this guy in streaking grime. And if you've not seen any of my videos before, I love this stuff. Whether it's in this way, where you smother the entire model, or you can use it very selectively, and you can also thin it down to use it as just like a standard wash. You've just got to wait for the thing to dry, or bring out a little trusty hairdryer and give it a little blitz. And then once it looks like this, a little bit of spirit and a makeup sponge, and you can see how you can just wick it down, and it just comes away and leaves all that grime in all the recessed areas. Now, as you can see, you can wipe it away, you can dab it, you can use all sorts of strange and wonderful techniques that will have an effect on how this settles. And I would have done this on 2 of the 3 ghouls. We're now jumping back to our clean ghoul, but this we'll be doing on all 3. And it is essentially going to just be dry brushing over the skin with the Fenrisian Grey, which was our base colour, and then Blue Horror as a highlight. And we're just making sure there's hardly any paint on our brush, and then just going over all the raised edges of the flesh, nice and gently, just to try and pick out those bony, knobbly bits. If you wanted to, after you've done the dry brushing, you could easily use a fine point brush and edge highlight, or just layer over any of the faces or raised areas if you wanted to make those lines a little bit more defined. So for our loincloth sections, we're going to use Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone, and all we're going to be doing is picking out the edges and the most raised areas. Bugman's Glow will be our main edge highlight for this, and then we're using Cadian Flesh Tone just for the sharpest edges and the highest points. Nothing too intense for this. We don't want to draw too much attention away from the flesh, because that's the main focal point of the model, but it just gives it that nice little bit of pop and definition. And a little bit of Cadian Flesh Tone will be on any of the human remains. Once we start working on the bone areas and the wraps, etc., all I'm doing is using the base colour, whether that be Abshanti Bone or Rakar Flesh, and using a 1-step highlight for each. For the fur, I'm just going to use a simple warm brown from Pro Acrylic and just give it a quick little dry brush. Nothing too fancy, but just something to give it a little bit more contrast and definition. But feel free, if you want to push it further, just to add the next tone up and just give it another dry brush on the very tips. So we're almost there for a nice, clean, battle-ready ghoul, but I'm going to just do a little highlight on the metallics, and I'm going to use chainmail from Vallejo and use a sponge just to add it on as a bit of chipping. So one little trick I was told, I got this from Peachy, was to put the sponge into the top of a brush protector, and you get a much more accurate and smaller sponge to work with, as opposed to holding it with a pair of tweezers. So shout out to that man. And a side note, if you wanted to add a little bit of rust, so I use the same brown and just use a sponge on his sword just to make it look a little bit dirty and a little bit rusty. So as you can see now, this is all 3 at the same stage. They've all gone through the same process, apart from this one has had a oil wash of the streaking grime, which makes it look a little bit more greeny than blue. And this one has the same oil wash, but has had the undershadow airbrushed in Screamer Pink from underneath, which shout out to Cult of Paint, because I saw on their video with ghouls, they did a very, very similar thing. I think these Baraknar Burgundy, and it was very cool. So my entire army will be like the middle one, but I just wanted to show a few variations in the same video as opposed to trying to do 3 separate videos. So at the final stages now, where we are dotting the I's and crossing the teeth, and we're just using a shanty bone for that. Now, once these guys are all done, it's a case of getting them based. Obviously, that is dealer's choice, but I'm going to be using AK's concrete, and then I will add a little bit of a black wash, and then maybe a dry brush, and that'll be it for these guys, I think. And this is how they came out. So the first one, which is nice and clean, nice and bold, nice and vibrant. If that's your style, much more of the classic Games Workshop style, which I really like. Oh, one note, his saliva, all I did was use bold titanium white. A few things you could do just to elevate them. A few more highlights would just push them further. And now we have the first grimed model, which I really like. It has a really swampy ghoul vibe, nice and grim. I'd imagine a whole army like this would look fantastic. Last but not least is my favourite, which I will be doing for my entire army, is the pink undershadow. For those of you who have me on Instagram, I've also done this exact style with a much more vibrant green skin, so I'll be using a combination of the two throughout. And that's it. That is all for this video. So once again, I'd like to just say thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, if you learned something, please do like, comment, and if you want to see more, please do subscribe because it really helps. And hopefully I shall see you on the next one.